In this video, I'll be helping you understand how the nervous system and the endocrine system regulate blood pressure. As we've already talked about a little bit in these videos, this is primarily the job of the sympathetic division, right? It's the most important. It actually innervates all of your blood vessels except capillaries, and it helps to activate those precapillary sphincters and the meta-arterioles. The vasomotor center means the blood vessel movement center, or blood pressure control center for all intents and purposes. It's right here in the most inferior portion of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata. And there are a few small nuclei in the pons as well. The excitatory part of this vasomotor center uses a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. Remember this one? In the autonomic chapter, you probably learned that norepinephrine is really the primary autonomic neurotransmitter. And it's also used as a hormone. We're going to find out the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. That's what helps to maintain that so-called vasomotor tone. There is an inhibitory portion which can cause vasodilation by decreasing sympathetic output. The key here is that unlike nearly everything else in the autonomic nervous system, which have sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation, the blood vessels have only sympathetic. And so it's either you're stimulating it to give more muscle tone, more vasomotor tone, or you're not stimulating it, and the blood pressure is what's increasing that dilation. Everything else, nearly everything else, like the pupils, the sympathetic makes them bigger, the parasympathetic makes them smaller. The stomach, the sympathetic shuts it down, the parasympathetic speeds it up, right? We call this dual innervation, and nearly everything that's involuntary in your body is controlled by this mechanism, but this is the rare exception. You have only sympathetic fibers to regulate your blood pressure. Now, the one clinical thing I can really make a connection to right now is this idea of people sometimes fainting, right? You get so excited that the blood pressure rises and that vasomotor tone increases, and then the vasomotor center will overreact and overcompensate, and then people's blood pressure just drops and they faint. So think back to the videos you've seen of Elvis Presley fans or Beatles fans. How can somebody who's so excited all of a sudden lose consciousness? I don't know, maybe it happens to Justin Bieber fans now. But anyway, that's how it works. Here's the hormonal control. Still on that sympathetic pathway. This is the link between the nervous system and the endocrine response to stress. And we used to call it adrenaline, right? We still use the phrase adrenaline rush. And this is really what we're talking about. During that fight or flight response, the spinal cord zaps the adrenal gland into action. And these little cells are really actually neurons. The chromaffin cells are those which release epinephrine, and to a lesser extent norepinephrine, into the bloodstream, where it will really amplify that stress response. It's interesting to me, maybe you'll find it interesting that these are actually neurons. They're technically the post-ganglionic sympathetic neurons, but this is a very strange but not completely isolated case of a neuron releasing a chemical into the bloodstream where it works like a hormone, instead of releasing the neurotransmitter to stimulate the next neuron in line, which is much more typical, right? Acetylcholine is released by the preganglionic sympathetic fiber to stimulate the chromaffin cell. But when the chromaffins release their neurotransmitter, it actually goes into the bloodstream where it acts like a hormone. So if you've ever had this experience, maybe someone startles you, or you have a near miss in nearly a car accident, there's almost an instantaneous release, maybe that breaking out in the cold sweat and just feeling that rush, that fear. That's almost instantaneous, and that's because the sympathetic fibers are ridiculously fast. However, maybe 5 or 6 seconds after your friend scares you or after that near miss, then you really feel your heart begin to pound. That's the effect of epinephrine in the bloodstream. Obviously, these two mechanisms have a synergistic effect in increasing blood pressure so that during emergency situations, we can get all of the blood that we need to our skeletal muscles to run for our lives or to fight for them if that's the case. Let's take a look at some of the short-term regulations of blood pressure. You can see here we have baroreceptor reflexes and chemoreceptor reflexes as our major headings here. Baroreceptor means pressure detector, right? Like the word barometric when we talk about weather. Barometric means to measure the pressure. So baroreceptor is really your way of detecting changes in blood pressure. Change in peripheral resistance, heart rate, stroke volume, all of these are going to be the effectors that help us to counteract that falling or rising blood pressure. In very much the same way, chemoreceptors are chemical receptors. They are sensory receptors for oxygen and CO2 and pH. Don't misunderstand me here. These do not give you conscious sensation like most of our other sensory receptors. You might be thinking of the tactile corpuscle or the rods and cones in the eye or the hair cells. These are also sensory receptors. The difference here is that instead of going to conscious regions of the cerebral cortex, these sensory receptors go to the medulla oblongata, just like our vasomotor center. So you're not going to be getting a conscious sensation of your oxygen, right? We can't ask our patients what their O2 saturation is. We need to measure it objectively. Okay, so let's see in a graphic way. The pressure detectors, those so-called baroreceptors, are found in the arch of the aorta and in the carotid sinus, which you're going to find where the common carotid splits into the internal and external carotid. There's a little bit of an enlargement of that vessel, and right there, along the endothelium, there are many, many of these little pressure sensors. So if you stand up too fast and your blood pressure begins to drop in your carotid arteries, you might feel dizzy and you might notice that your vision is changing. You're not really sensing the change in blood pressure, though. It's an indirect effect. Here's what happens. Those baroreceptors send a signal along the glossopharyngeal nerve. Remember, that's cranial nerve number 9, to the vasomotor center. And in the case of falling blood pressure, we're going to send a sympathetic signal to the blood vessels to tell them to tighten up a little bit to try to boost the pressure. And we're going to send a sympathetic signal to the heart to tell the heart to beat more quickly and more forcefully. And it only takes a couple of seconds for these mechanisms to really restore blood pressure. So you stand up too fast, you feel a little faint, and within 3 or 4 seconds, everything's back to normal. That's a normal homeostatic mechanism to help maintain blood pressure. But what if the blood pressure were too high? What if you are you have hypervolemia or hypernatremia, or if you are running at an incredible pace and your blood pressure starts to get too high? Do these baroreceptors detect that change? Yep. Do they send a signal to the vasomotor center? Yep. What's the response? First of all, they stop the sympathetic response. Remember that blood vessels are not dually innervated. They don't have parasympathetic stimulation here. So the only way that we can lessen the vasomotor tone or cause vasodilation is to simply turn this signal off. Now, in a synergistic way, the parasympathetic system also wants to lower that blood pressure. And so there is, remember, parasympathetic innervation to the heart. And so what we see here is an inhibitory signal being sent to the SA and AV node, which is going to decrease both heart rate and force of contractility. So you can watch this video, excellent, help you walk through it. Here's a different graphic way of describing exactly the same thing. And you might think of pausing the video here to walk yourself through all of these different steps. Here we see the cycle, the feedback loop, and this is the graph of the blood pressure to really see help you see what happens when our blood pressure gets too high, how we lessen it, and what happens if our blood pressure is too low, how we raise it back up into normal ranges. In a very similar way, there are chemical receptors in the carotid body and the arch of the aorta once again. These also do not lead to conscious awareness when chemical changes in the blood occur, but in the same way they detect the chemical change and send it to involuntary regions. The medulla oblongata once again. We're going to revisit this neurology in the respiratory the respiratory chapter as well. So you're going to get 2 for the price of 1 if you learn it now. But here's how it works. If oxygen levels fall or carbon dioxide levels rise, the chemical detectors send a signal through these cranial nerves to the medulla oblongata. And in this case, it would be sending a sympathetic effect to the heart, right? If I have low oxygen or if I have high carbon dioxide, then I need to speed up my heart, speed up my perfusion of the pulmonary circuit. Likewise, if oxygen levels are sufficient and carbon dioxide levels are low or maybe even too low, we might want to slow down the heart so that our body has more of a chance to absorb the carbon dioxide and restore that normal balance too. Once again, here's a different graphic representation. You could pause the video here to make sure that you understand all of the components of this feedback loop, that you could put them in the correct order, and that you can really understand if blood pH increases, for example, what is the body's response to that? Or if blood pH decreases and we go into acidosis, what's going to happen here? How's the body going to respond to that? Here's one of the very last parts of the chapter. We get to learn about this amazing and complicated process called the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. Wow. So what are the major players? Renin. Renin is an enzyme, not a hormone. Remember that enzymes are proteins that have just the right shape to speed up a chemical reaction. In this case, converting this chemical into this one. Angiotensinogen is a potential hormone. We call it a precursor. It's not yet a hormone, but it is almost completed, and it's released by the liver into the bloodstream. Angiotensinogen has virtually no physiological effect on blood pressure, but when renin activates it into the first form, angiotensin 1, we will see some response. Now look at that word. Angio means blood vessel, like the word angioplasty or angiogram. Angiotensin simply means to tighten up the blood vessel. And if we look down here, we see that that will be one of the downstream effects, vasoconstriction, which occurs by tightening up the tunica media, the smooth muscle within the blood vessel, angiotensin. Now here's the deal. Angiotensin 1 isn't nearly as potent and powerful as angiotensin 2. So we need a second enzyme to turn this one into that one. What is this enzyme? It's called angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE, as in ACE inhibitor. Have you heard of that before? Very broadly prescribed class of medications that are used to treat high blood pressure. ACE inhibitors prevent the conversion of angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And because this one is much more powerful, it mitigates the effects. In other words, it doesn't allow this to be quite as powerful as it otherwise would be. And so our blood pressure won't be quite as high as it would be if this pathway were complete. Okay, so in young and healthy people, most of the angiotensin 1 is converted into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a much more potent vasoconstrictor, so that has one way of increasing blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 also stimulates the adrenal cortex to release another hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone is sometimes called the salt-retaining hormone. And when our levels of aldosterone are high in our bloodstream, our kidney keeps the sodium in our bloodstream instead of spilling it into the urine. Now, this is related to osmosis. I know this is getting off on a little bit of a tangent here, but remember that water follows salt. It's one of the ways to think about osmosis. If there's a lot of salt in the bloodstream, then water will tend to stay in the bloodstream. So this is the way that aldosterone increases water reabsorption. And when our water levels go up, our blood volume goes up. And when our blood volume increases, our blood pressure increases. Wow, that is a lot of information. How should you approach learning this? Well, you could rewind the video and listen to me explain it again. You could go on YouTube and find other videos. But I think one of the best ways to do it is to cut this apart into what we might think of as a jigsaw. You should make a flashcard for each of these components. Make one that has a liver on it, and make a flashcard that says angiotensinogen, and make one for each of these components. Then, shuffling up your deck, you have to lay it out on the tabletop, making what we might think of as a concept map, so that you can really think through where each of these parts belongs. Here's my advice. Don't stare at this graphic for more than 5 or 6 minutes. This is not a good way to learn. It's a good reference, but you need to put the information right out on the table into your hands as quickly as you can, and that's the most efficient and powerful way to learn. There's another hormone we need to learn about. It's called antidiuretic hormone, sometimes called vasopressin. Vasopressin. That makes me think of pressing on a blood vessel, and that's helpful too. It helps me to remember that vasopressin, or ADH, does also increase blood pressure, although through a different mechanism than the renin-angiotensin system. Here's how it works. When you are dehydrated, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Do you know this word, diuretic? A diuretic is something that makes you pee a lot, right? It increases the rate of urine formation. So what's an antidiuretic then? Well, it decreases urine formation, and that's what we see right here. Increased reabsorption of the water by the kidney. In other words, the water stays in the bloodstream. The water does not leak out into the urine at the same rate. And so, once again, by maintaining blood volume, we maintain blood pressure. There's a synergistic effect here as well. ADH also has a mild vasoconstricting effect, nothing like what we see with angiotensin 2, but a synergistic effect nonetheless. So we can see here blood volume and blood pressure both go up with ADH as well. A couple of extra credit questions here. I'm not going to talk too much about ANP. Atrial natriuretic hormone, ANH. We're not going to talk about that one too much, but if you're interested, you might see that as an extra credit question. These other things are very important. We've already talked about fluid shift in previous videos. Think anaphylaxis or borborygmi or lymphedema, right? So you need to understand this concept. And then, of course, I would just like to mention that we have a great ability to affect our body by working on relaxing. we're going to have the opportunity to practice some mindfulness meditation in a future video. But for those of you who have spent time at a retreat or done yoga or meditated or done Tai Chi or done quilting or played chess, there are really so many different ways to quiet our mind and to relax our body. Although we don't have a direct control over our blood pressure, the research is very clear that when we learn how to quiet our mind, our body goes into that parasympathetic mode. And in that way, we have an indirect but very positive effect on health. Okay, good time to pause the video. Make sure you can answer all of these questions. And then begin to work your way through the sample questions and your growing collection of flashcards. You can email me if you have any questions.